Chapter 3. Looking for Meeting. The Unification with Kindness. Unifying with kindness prevents the development of the vigilante fragment. Krivoruchko Sr.'s psyche did not develop a fragment of the vigilante only because of his unification with kindness. As a soldier, he did his duty and later participated in battles. He faced the enemy and was part of the collective, but he was not radicalized. His external bonds with the collective wanted him to be vigilant and become part of the killing machine, but he was unusual. During his service, he never had any vigilante thoughts of revenge by killing or torturing in return for what was done to his family. The soul of Krivoruchko Sr. was saved by the good-heartedness of his new friends. After the devastating effect of splitting by hate and coarse treatment, the Krivoruchkos found hospitality from complete strangers. Suddenly, to his total disbelief, he encountered unification with kindness. He had a real meeting that made a difference in his life and his soul, and he eventually found an exit from the butcher shop. Unfortunately, during this time, only a few were able to find this peace. When we have big losses, we have our own reactions. Even when we meet kindness, we have contradictory responses of pain and suffering. Some of us are overwhelmed with our pain and become completely insensitive. Many of us, in similar situations, have opposite responses, and we actually become more understanding and compassionate. Only after facing hardship do we eventually understand the value of kindness and generosity. We were taking those qualities for granted because in our life we never faced the indifference and rudeness. The friendship with Luchko's family restored Krivoruchko and Leonya's trust in kindness and prevented their psyches from splitting even more. They did not develop hate and aversion as the main driving force in their lives. They did not become incapable of showing kindness and friendship. In the meantime, Krivoruchko Sr., as a new member of the unit, did guard duty, chopped wood, and took parts in attacks on convoys carrying supplies for the enemies. Stepan Luchko had more responsible jobs. He went from village to village collecting information and encouraging the inhabitants to resist. In one of the villages, he was betrayed and arrested by the Polizais, who were corrupt wretches. The partisans attacked the village, but Luchko had already been taken to the regional headquarters. The partisans burned down the informer's house. Galina and her daughter could not stop weeping. They constantly knelt in front of the icon, praying for Stepan Luchko's life to be spared. It was the Krivoruchko's turn to show concern for their friends, and they were ready to do everything for Galina and Marinka. Because we lost our family, we understood the situation of others. We are very grateful for all support. The Krivoruchkos did not have any doubt in their mind that Luchko's family needed to be repaid for their hospitality. They would do everything to help this family, even if they needed to give up their lives. Now they were generating compassion and caring. Galina and Marinka had unification with kindness. Their spiritual power enabled them to keep hope and believe that goodness would prevail. The kindness of their friends also prevented their psyches from splitting and developing vigilante fragments. The plasticity of the fragment. Plasticity is the ability of the fragment to provide several discrete responses. In other words, it can be flexible in responses. The plasticity is a sign of preparedness for unification. Contrarily, the responses with hate as a base are rigid and do not deviate. The rigid responses are always about destroying. The splitting fragments are rigid and do not have the luxury of flexibility. The role of the villain or vigilante is to prevent a rigid fragment from having responses other than hate and anger. The distinctive roles that are by each of the fragments are the signs of flexibility of responses. The flexible responses are about meetings and unification. Krivoruchko Sr.'s friend and fellow fighter Stepan Luchko was betrayed by wretches. The first thoughts of Krivoruchko Sr. at this stressful time were not about punishment of the traitors, but about the most efficient way to liberate Stepan Luchko. The feelings of hate and vigilance did not overpower his feelings of compassion and friendship. His thoughts were also about providing maximum comfort to his friend's family. Krivoruchko Sr.'s psyche had a flexible and stable construction. He did not have any goals of destruction. His psyche was built on love. Contrarily, the psyche that is built on hate has a very rigid construction and creates the monster of destruction. The psyche that is assembled on the foundation of hate is very fragile and suffers from the lack of plasticity. Professor Krivoruchko states that the fragments that have a base of love are able to generate several dissimilar responses. He consciously identifies the presence of those fragments in his psyche. Those fragments are Krivoruchko Sr., Leonia, and Stepan Luchko. They represent his father, two of his grandfathers, and they interact by using plasticity in their responses. They are a big dominance in his psyche. Because of their positive influence, he has a stable and solid identity. From the structure of Krivoruchko Sr. and Leonia's fragments, we see that they are the combinations of the victim, the warrior, and the savior. Stepan Luchko's fragment was aligned with others. Primarily, he was a warrior and a savior, but recently he had added victim side by being betrayed by wretches. The three fragments of Professor Krivoruchko's psyche hold a construction that reflects the same belief system. Because they are represented by diverse manners of its appearance, it's possible that they may not be replaced by one fragment, even though they believe in the same moral values. Each of them is operating on distinctive approaches and sensory responses, which are visual, oral, and kinesthetic. The fragment that represents Krivoruchko Sr. is a military man, and he has a significant visual assertion. Stepan Luchko is a teacher and represents oral articulation. Leonia is a boy who answers to his kinesthetic affirmation. Despite separate manners, those fragments have complete reciprocity in Professor Krivoruchko's psyche because the oral stimulations are accurately translated to visual and kinesthetic responses and vice versa. The congruency of translation, which is done on the conscious level, contains a big advantage in building his identity. If the translation of the stimulations is wrong, then the responses become incongruent. The fragments would not have dialogues and meetings, and as a result, we find it inconvenient to be unified. If our responses are incongruent, they lose their flexibility and we produce misleading responses. Our flexibility goes together with congruence, and our flexible fragments have a better possibility of translation into other forms of expression. When our fragments are unified in groups, where each of our fragments has an ability to provide several discrete responses, then we see the signs of plasticity. The female's fragments. The female's fragments are important in the construction of the self because they provide for us distinctive gender responses. Our mothers, grandmothers, and sisters are very important partners in the dialogue. Their responses help us to be more human. Whereas the male fragments represent warriors, the female fragments signify smoothness and homely life and an abundance of feeling and warmth and contentment. Every male has at least one fragment in his psyche that represents his mother or another female and brings up positive feelings. The fragment of the mother as a unifying force carries a lot of good emotions. However, some of us definitely do not feel good about our mothers. We feel that our mother did not raise us right and split us away from love. In Leonia's life, his mother and sister were brutally murdered by heartless zombies, and therefore his psyche was almost consumed by hate and feelings of vengeance. His mother, who shared her very last moment of breath with her daughter and her father, pushed him away from death, life. His father also constantly saw the horrifying nightmares where his wife shared her last breath of air with his little daughter. The tragic death of his wife and daughter caused a separation from his love and his dreams. He was split in the horror of misery from the tenderness of his daughter's love and the warmness of his wife's hugs. The ugly concept of genetic purification was skillfully planted in the skulls of the many empty-headed followers. Because of the world's indifference, the loved ones were thrown into the coldness of unmarked graves and were accompanied only by the smear of injustice. The split created a hole in Krivoruchko Sr.'s psyche, which was probably filled with hate and resentment. Hate creates more hate and more splitting. Hate's opposite is compassion and creates the need for unification. Galina and Marinka are fragments of survivors and saviors. They are very positive and reinforce an unstable structure. They represent compassion, care, and comfort, and their purpose is to be loved and to love. They are far away from hate and aggravation. The one way to deal with hate is to strengthen the area of love in our psyche. The area of love gets bigger and enhanced, and in turn the area of hate gets smaller. The female fragments in the male psyche are usually associated with compassion and understanding. Our mothers are the unifying force and help to build a solid identity. In Professor Krivoruchko's psyche, Galina and Marinka represent the unifying forces of the universe, bringing responses of love and compassion. The fragment of the survivor. Our fragment of the survivor triggers splitting until danger exists. But eventually, when our life is less dangerous, our fragments stop splitting, and when we feel safe, we join the forces of unification. After the danger is gone, many of us are not ready to stop fighting, and therefore we become vigilantes because we do not know how to rebuild our lives. When we are destined to survive, we have a choice to keep hate and vigilance or look for love and compassion. Some of us will always be part of the hate and death and will not rest until we have closure. We may be sure that those responsible for the biggest injustice get their punishment. During the occupation, the enemy burned Galina and Marinka's village. Many partisans were captured and tortured and executed by the fascist servants. It was learned that Stepan Luchko had been sent to a concentration camp in Poland, but details about his fate were unknown. He was reported to be lost, without any news, probably exterminated. Galina, Marinka, Krivoruchko Sr., and Leonia survived and at last were liberated. While Leonia remained with Galina and Marinka, Krivoruchko Sr. resumed his military service as a soldier in the Soviet army. He had no surviving relatives except for his son. His wife and daughter were killed in the Baby Yar and interred in the mass grave, the place of their death. For a long time there was no monument or memorial sign, which made him very sad. After the war, he served a short term as part of the occupying force and was later demobilized because of his age. He reunited with Leonia, Galina, and Marinka. In his loneliness, he became even more attached to Galina. She called him Alexander or Sasha. He did not want to live in the village, having lived in a big city all of his life. He suggested to Galina that they move to the city, and she agreed. Alexander left first. In the city where he grew up, he found only strangers. All the Jewish neighbors had been killed. Strangers lived in his father's house and had many children. During the fascist occupation, they took Krivoruchko's house, did not want to leave, and were very hostile. It was probably reasonable to evict them, but on the other hand, Alexander did not want to fight with them. He understood that he would not be able to live in the house where everything reminded him of his losses. The war had been finished, but the hate lingered and forced him to split more. When there is danger around us, we continue to split. The attitude of love can turn to hate. Love is a way of thinking that can be reversed to hate. The feeling of love is easily translated to hate, but feelings of hate are very seldom transferred to love. We experience love and hate as complementary feelings to the same individuals. Our psyche uses some translator interpreting love and hate to the dissimilar sensors. We express feelings of love and hate through sounds, visual perception, kinesthetic expressions, and smell. Our fragments are less rigid when our internal translator correctly interprets the stimulations. Our psyche also has an automatic verbal translator that verbally describes our visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory experiences. We may verbalize the complementary feelings of love and hate. The internal translator contains an independent capacity to pick up material for conversion. When the translator is stoked by feelings of hate, it interprets only the experiences related to hate and brings up our consciousness the images, sound, and movements associated with hate. In that time, we are sure that we have had closure on abhorrence, our feelings of revulsion are decreased, and we are dealing with them in an appropriate manner. When the translator changes the output of conversion from hate to love, we display the experiences of love with completely altered references. It translates only experiences attributed to love. The images of love might not be mixed with images of hate. To be sure the psyche is avoiding mistake, we identify the new experiences by a separate name. We have problems with conversion and severe disturbance when we mix together images of love and hate. Krivoruchko Sr. got to relatively safe surroundings and at last was in the process of accumulating love and altering his references. Because the oral, visual, and kinesthetic changes that required significant alteration, for now he was identified by another name, Alexander. He would not love with references of the massacre and pain. He needed atypical references because he was translating his experiences from hate, depression, aggravation, and despair to love and tenderness. It was very grueling to grow something on the ashes. and a new perception was needed for his surroundings. He was getting farther ahead just from being a survivor. Alexander wanted new experiences in life and to give love and to support others. He was ready to build a new family and to have a new nest. Professor Krivoruchko declared that because of those transformations which had happened to his grandfather, Professor Krivoruchko, who was not yet born, had so many opportunities. As the child of the survivors, Professor Krivoruchko arrived as the messenger of love. The process of transforming hate to love was not an easy one when the main goal was to survive. Love was a burden. Only when the new generation arrived could we understand that love was still alive. After the miracles of surviving and after they gave respect to the dead, the transition from hate to love became possible. They dealt with very important issues of safety, which included establishing a safe nest. They were concerned about their ability to provide safety for future generations. Professor Krivoruchko's thoughts were, we ought to be consciously aware of how we express our feelings, because the feelings probably are easily reversed. We need to be sure that love will not possibly become hate again. We need to be aware of what is going on in our own surroundings. Many times by venting anger, we are just reinforcing it. To be ready for love, we may not only vent, but must deal with anger. Only when we reach an agreement on a conscious level with the fragments of hate can we perhaps process the fragments that are associated with love. We have diverse goals and we want to encounter love. By experiencing love, we learn how to properly express our love. We translate the feelings of love from the kinesthetic to the oral and to the visual expression. If we do not deal with hate in a proper way, the translator automatically picks up our feelings and may also pick up previous feelings of hate. It is also very essential for us to understand that before we love, we need to know how we are handling the hate inside of us. We must identify and process the fragments that are aligned with anger. It is important to know our inventory before we start something anew. We as the survivors are required to find out what kind of underlying processes are below the surface. Quote, when we vent anger by hitting a pillow, we release the kinesthetic anger and then we feel better and become contained. The problem is that we do not know for how long we will keep it contained. In some instances, the venting does not help us at all. To deal with dissimilar experiences of anger, we have to inspect our visual, oral, and olfactory styles. If they did not vent anger and did not provide desirable relief, then we continue to be affected by brain chemistry associated with hate and anger. Because we do not want any shortcut solutions, we need to deal with anger on a deeper level. We should take as much time as we need to build a conscious awareness of the subconscious processes. We know that the experience of loving kindness is very fragile, and we cannot mix it together with the ventilation of anger. We need to be careful when we translate love to distinguishing senses because we use the same translator to interpret our other feelings, including the feelings of hate. Unification with love avoids love-hate responses. Professor Krivoruchko also acknowledges we need to be sure that before we unify with love, we split from hate. He says by unifying with love, it is essential to avoid love-hate responses because we do not want to add more uncertainty to our lives. When we just hate, we have more clarity and understanding of our feelings. We just know that we hate with all of our strength. The identity that is in the transition from hate to love goes through the adaptation to the new way of being. Our overall responses are changing, and during the transition might mix love and hate responses. It happens because hate is very strong and does not want to leave us. It takes us into another trap and hides behind love. To avoid love-hate responses would cause only confusion. First, we need to identify all the hate responses and properly process them. Eventually, the transformation from Krivoruchko Sr. to Alexander was completed, but he dealt with hate and love for a long time. In his thoughts, he was dealing with many questions. If the opposite of hate is love, how come love does not resist hate? Love loses power and becomes weak when hate monsters use love to intensify hate, sneaking behind love and doing their dirty job. To achieve their goal, they use high love rhetoric, like patriotic love to the country, love to God, love to their race, and love to family. The resistance to hate is meditation and in reflection, and by understanding that we cannot stop hate with hate. I know that somewhere deep inside we have a knowledge about real love. I'm afraid that we lost the notion of real love because of life's hardship and ignorance. It is interesting that we never forget hate. Alexander continued with his thoughts. As little children, we are aware of hate. We can imagine nasty things that we might do to one we hate. We can be very vicious and show no mercy. We do not need to learn how to hate. Our imagination is very intense because hate brings a lot of energy to our lives. After venting hateful feelings, we probably feel good. We feel relieved as though we had gotten rid of hate. We punch pillows and punching bags, imagining that we are punching someone who is the cause of our stress, the violator of our happiness. Feelings of hate are present during the vending. We get rid of hate by using anger and hate. Even though we feel relief, nevertheless, we may not rely on hate as a healing tool. This is not a real healing. Real healing builds a resistance to hate and to learning about real love. The master of the universe is the one who can be immune to hate. He knows the secret of how to be cool and how to fight hate without the overwhelming intensity of his emotions. We do not need to fight hate with hate. We need to use wisdom. Our future endeavor is to stop hate with wisdom. To do it, we might need to recognize that hate is inside of us. We might not be able to control the hate of others, but we can control our own hate. Wisdom is also the knowledge of love, desire of learning more about love and opening up our hearts to the experience of love. Wisdom helps us know our limits. Sometimes hate is so overwhelming that everything around us contributes to it. We also know the power of hate. By its influence, we get in a state where all fears diminish, including the fear of death. Hate may be a painkiller or a narcotic. We need to know how much hate we can handle before we become addicted to it. Our hateful identity is so miserable that eventually we are willing to split with hate and to unify with love. Love gives us dignity and pleasure, but we must be careful not to get ambushed again. During the transition from hate to love, we may get trapped in a mixed love-hate response. The experience of hate. We have dissimilar ways to display our feelings, and hate might be present in the diverse channels of emotions and expressions. Hate grinding is a visual response of hate. When we hear hate in the timbre of the voice, it is an oral response. A response is kinesthetic when aggressive posture represents nonverbal expressions of hate. When we convey our feelings of hate, we are not concerned with what approach we use. Professor Krivoruchko mentions that we have inherited abilities to interpret our feelings from dissimilar types of expression. Our psyche has the translator, and we use universal frames of reference that are described by common expressions. We do interpret our experiences on verbal and nonverbal levels, and sometimes hate is expressed only by facial expressions. We receive many recognizable responses from distinctive modalities, and only after interpretation do we understand that we are observing hate. If the responses are not clear, that means there is not enough information regarding the feelings we are observing. A most confusing situation arises when the kinesthetic expression is absent because agitation produced by hate usually goes together with our tightness and aggressive postures. When we are relaxing, we are not tight and we do not make any aggressive gestures. We assume we do not experience hate. That perhaps is a wrong conclusion. Our oral and visual responses are not free of hate. Some of us are masters of instigating hate, and we would not take a gun and shoot or push the helpless, but we have the foolishness to say or write a lot of hateful things, to influence others to hate, and to express hate by brutal kinesthetic style. Only in our fantasy may we feel that we are completely free of hate. If we do not hate anyone, then probably we are hated by someone. We need to accept the fact that hate will always be around. We cannot eradicate hate, but we need to find a way to change the damages from it. Alexander wanted to understand how to deal with hate and discover its roots. He knew that hate and love were opposites and complementary, and for him it was very important to achieve the decrease of hate and the increase of love. It has not yet happened that love is bigger than hate, but the opposite has happened many times. Hate is easy to learn and to copy. In many instances, hate has a wider range of emotions than love. If more hate gets around, that means love is decreased. Unfortunately, real love is hard to recognize. Alexander had the strength to function because he had a son who needed him. If his son had not been close, there would have been no reason for him to continue for his search for love. The father saved his son, but the son was a savior too. Leonya did not understand that with his love he saved his father's soul. He was an addition to the area of goodness, where fragments had roles of being victims to be saved and being saviors. Alexander's thoughts of hate included thoughts that hate had dissimilar manners. He declared, "I express hate in visual forms and also feel it. I hate the enemy's radical collective. When I saw their marches, then I felt that I had completely given in to hate. A vicious enemy killed my family. I am not unresponsive, and I hate. I am therefore part of the collective, but I feel that my collective is less vicious. When two collectives fight, they are driven by revulsion. They hate in order to suppress guilt, increase aggression, and grab without any remorse. As an individual, I have an oral experience of hate when someone insults and degrades me. When someone does terrible things to me, I lose my head and answer back. The kinesthetic experience of hate is the desire to stop the assumed generator of hate by killing, damaging, and inflicting pain. The olfactory stimulations associated with trauma create hateful feelings, too. A particular odor may trigger a range of hateful emotions. To resist hate is to check our responses on diverse styles. Alexander continued, I do not want to ignore the fact that I hate, and that perhaps someone may hate me too. I feel that hate gets bigger and blows up in my face. We should not ignore hate until it is too late to intervene. When someone is not attacking us physically, but with his attitude, the tone of his voice, and his facial grimaces, he helps us recognize hate. We need to detect hate and be prepared to intercept it by all available diverse approaches. The protection of love requires planning ahead. The protection of love from hate requires planning ahead and making a lot of changes in life. Keeping love alive is a full-time job and needs a lot of deep thought and wise actions. Even small outbursts of hate have the strength to spoil love. Everything involved with hate remains with us as losses. When we want to have a second chance at living, perhaps it is wiser to go away from that place. When we miraculously survive but lose a significant one, safety becomes very important to us. When we decide to be together with someone, we need to make sure that hate will not damage our new beginning. We may well prepare the self to function on an uncommon level of awareness. Love includes unification on the visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory level. In love, we express our feelings verbally and by many beautiful words. We take care of our appearance, using fantasy and creativity to express our love. We want to make visual expressions, use vivid movements, and wear pleasant fragrances. Our expression of love needs a special atmosphere, well protected and not spoiled by hate. When we as adults are in love, the love includes intimacy. The atmosphere of intimacy is very fragile and may easily be destroyed by hate. Because of hate, our intimacy can easily become a mechanical process without feelings, and that can lead to the end of love. Professor Krivoruchko adds that the hateful feeling is not easy to control. It produces split and aggression in the form of special sensory expressions. It uses the hateful verbalization, which is consistent with the hateful look. It limits movement and pollutes our responses by hateful gestures. The split by hate separates us from many human feelings, and as a result exhibits complete numbness to the suffering of others. When we want to protect love, the best decision is to move away from the place where hate exists. The killing machine did its job well. The pomposity, pretension, and grandiosity split Alexander from his birthplace, where people were polluted with radical ideas. He decided to leave Ukraine forever and move to the east. He wanted to live in Moscow, but settled for St. Petersburg. As a veteran of the war, he easily obtained a working permit. He applied and was accepted as an accountant in a military factory. He found a dwelling and later was joined by Galina and the children. When they received identification documents, Alexander and his son remembered their past and registered in the Soviet collective as part of a domineering ethnicity. Leonya did not want to go to regular school, where he was a little older than his classmates. He found work as an apprentice to a machinist in the same factory where his father worked. In the evenings, he attended general education classes, while Marinka continued her studies at a regular school. Galina also found work in Alexander's office. In time, Alexander and Galina came to the conclusions that they could be happy together. In the beginning, they were embarrassed at the mere thought of their feelings, but time heals all wounds. When wounded souls get together, they hope for a good future. It is important to provide security to the new nest, and to succeed in life, we need to make a lot of smart decisions, plans, and wise moves. Hate is very adaptive. Professor Krivoruchko acknowledges that hate may easily infect peaceful doctrines and concepts with rage and a splitting force. Hate is very adaptive and takes atypical forms. By winning subsequent ideology battles, hate gets even for the defeat. Hate is very adaptive to diverse environments and changes its appearance according to circumstances. To forget the power of hate is to leave the self-defenseless to new splits. Nevertheless, time is the most important factor in dealing with hate because time has an anesthetic power. It seems that when more time passes from the traumatic experience, we feel less pain, but the past is a lesson which should not be forgotten. A part of Alexander's psyche was designated to be a savior and protector. If a change in identification documents would protect his family, he was going to alter his ID, even if it was illegal. He struggled with the question, is it important to be a Jew in front of others? He did not appreciate any public displays and wanted very much to be a Jew, but only in his heart. He had learned his lesson. He did not have to prove anything to the hateful. He decided to be a Jew in his heart and did not betray the memory of anyone in his family who were dead in the Baba Yar. His identity would not change, even though on his ID card, instead of a Jew, there would be printed the domineering ethnicity of the Soviet collective. The Jews in the Soviet collective were considered an ethnic group, and this matter was reflected on an ID card. In the Soviet collective on job applications, membership in a library or athletic club and any other application was as fifth important question. After the family name, address, and marital status, ethnicity was always questioned. Alexander felt that he did not need to be asked about his ethnicity. He was not able to learn from his history. In the Soviet collective, Jewish schools were not available and religion was forbidden. It was wrong to assume that a member of the workers' paradise, even with his proficiency in the language of the domineering ethnicity, may be accepted as a member of his ethnicity. He was deprived from learning his own language. He actually knew a little Yiddish, the language of the European Jews, but he did not know how to read and write in this language. He also wondered why the Jews in the workers' paradise were, and what made them, the scapegoats. Alexander also knew that the Soviet collective was very shrouded. It officially obeyed the existing law and went along with declaring Jews an ethnic group. The Soviet collective allocated to the Jews a piece of land in Siberia on the border with China. In reality, this piece of land on the Far East, called the Birobidzhan, was only symbolic. It was mainly inhabited by Chinese and mosquitoes. The promotion of the Jews in the collective to the nation's status brought a lot of suffering to the Jews. It was the same as giving them the status of scapegoats. In all of the republics of the collective and their satellite states, the Jews were easily identified and persecuted at work and sport and during the distribution of goods. In many instances, they were denied resettlement in big cities, which required special permission from authorities. The Jews were blamed for everything bad that happened. In the collective rule, all the nations were supposed to be equal, but in reality, only the domineering ethnicity was promoted as a hero by the government-controlled media. The other ethnicities were demoted level. During the war, the strong nationalistic approach of the media helped to energize members to defend the Soviet collective. For the propaganda machine, the right way was to call all ethnicities in the Soviet collective commie. Then they would all feel equal. The name sounded very much like Nazi. The nationalistic tendencies continued after the war. The glory in the Soviet collective was not equally shared by everyone. The radio played the very sentimental songs of only the domineering ethnicity. It appeared that the victims and heroes came solely from the domineering ethnicity. Because of the question of ethnicity in any application, the benefits of winning the war were projected only on the members of the domineering ethnicity. Possession of the identification card made them proud because they belonged. In the collective, the other ethnicities did not have the luxury to be recognized, and it appeared that they did not suffer during the war and did not produce any heroes. Despite the fact that the Jewish soldiers and partisans contributed a lot to the victory of the Soviet collective, they received no recognition for their heroic fights and were not appreciated by the collective. They were designated scapegoats and were put down by everyone with hatred in his heart. The biggest shame that one of the greatest cities, where many Jews died from hunger and from defending it, exhibited the strongest xenophobic feeling. It was challenging to understand why this nonsense had a place in the wounded city. There were distinctive explanations which could be relevant to the local situation about how many significant contributors to hate to the collective. But one of the simplest is that the hater came from the members of the Soviet collective dislocated from the occupied territories. They moved to the city after the war, were angry, and kept hatred as justification of their crimes, and their children inherited this hate. When the collective fell apart, the hate came out in extreme displays. The migrants were mainly women, impregnated by enemy soldiers. They were the occupied territories and were connected with the fascist ideology. They moved to the city with their children and took the living space of dead defenders. They kept the hatred alive. The newcomers and their offspring carried the hate of the fascists. And the victory of the Soviet collective was not complete because the ideology of hate survived. Without any remorse, the newcomers occupied the houses of the victims who were starved to death. Because of a shortage of available space, the newcomers were finger-pointing, calling the Jewish survivors insulting names and intimidating them. The hate easily adapted to the special place and the dissimilar ideology. We do not want to disclose information of our ethnicity. We must not be forced to disclose our private information, the information about our ethnicity and religion. When we are not comfortable to release it, this information must be protected and remain confidential. The government's request for the mandatory disclosure of this information is an act of discrimination. In the workers' paradise, the government asked the people to disclose our private information. The reason was not for their protection, but an intention to discriminate them by inventing these quotas. There were quotas to get employment, education, and justice. By any common sense, in those particular circumstances, one should not reveal private information and did not need to answer trustfully. Alexander and Leonia's history already taught them that the painful lesson about answering a question trustfully. After the war, the power holders of the collective adapted the segregation rules for the ethnicity. They created for each minority the quotas for unemployment, housing, and praise. They did not want cultural adaptation. They wanted to screen minority out. The minority was marked because genetically they were not part of the domineering ethnicity. It did not matter that they perfectly knew the domineering language and history. They would never be equal. The genetic view of minorities came from the ideology of racism. As minorities were born and resided in regions of domineering ethnicity, but by regulations of collective were always minorities and can never have the domineering ethnicity. The fact that we have perfect command in domineering language and do not know any other languages did not matter. If we'd been members of the domineering ethnicity and lived somewhere else as a minority, then we'd cling right to our region. When we moved back to our ethnic region, and even if we'd never lived there before and do not know the domineering language, on our ID cards we were identified as a domineering ethnicity. Without knowing of language and history, we are closer to minorities who are perfectly speaking the language and know the history. There was genetic screening in the Soviet collective. Minorities in every region of the collective were subject to undisclosed but very specific quotas and limits. Those limits were a reason to deny the minorities benefits to which they were entitled. The official propaganda glorified the members of the domineering ethnicity and attributed to them exceptional and far-fetched qualities that were exaggerated. It looked like minorities did not participate in any heroic actions. This attitude continued after the war, the same way as the fascist ideology to screen the genetically inferior in the working paradise wanted the domineering ethnicity to be more protected. The Soviet collective declared through their policies that the domineering ethnicity had a government that provided them with very valuable benefits and safeguarded them against minorities. The propaganda fabricated evidence to justify the entitlement of the minority to more benefits. As a result, the minorities felt even more inferior. In the Soviet collective, we were the descendants of many great nations, but only one domineering ethnicity was chosen as the older and wiser brother. The movies and TV programs floated with characters that were disciplined, very moral, and unaffected by any impulses. They behaved as the monks in a monastery, genetically pure and very attractive. Those fictitious characters displayed enormous love for their homeland and were presented as the standards for patriotism and bravery. This brainwash was confusing for everyone. and caused the members of majority ethnicity to feel unjustifiably superior. In actuality, it was a copy of the ideology of the fascists. The radical ideology entitled members of the domineering ethnicity to intimidate and discriminate because they believed that the minorities were the freeloaders and that only the majority ethnicity was the productive force. The drunken, irritable members of the elitist majority could, without any repercussion, call minorities by insulting names and cast them out from a public place. The minorities did not have any way to complain because everyone understood that they were not entitled to any equal rights. In many instances, as Jews in the Soviet collective, we had more problems than the other minorities. The difference was that the other minorities perhaps could learn their own language and history, but Jews could not, as Jews were not able to learn anything about history and language. The collective found the way to rationalize it with the connection of Jewish language and history with religion. We were not allowed to learn about religion. It was strictly forbidden to teach Jewish history in school. We do not have the pride that we were the biblical ethnicity and that our history and language was part of many religions. Professor Krivoruchko says, as a minority, we were not protected against harassment. In the Soviet collective as Jews, we had little fictitious place, but it was not our historical region of the inhabitation. The region on the border with China was without any of our historical roots. Instead of being a historical homeland, this place was established to keep criminals away from the big cities. It was a piece of land populated by mosquitoes and did not have any elementary conveniences. After miraculous survival, Alexander Krivoruchko did not want to go with his family to Birobidzhan. He had lived through the atrocities inflicted by the hatred and did not want to be an easy target. He did not know when any villains would come next, though his son did not mind having an ID card of the dominant ethnicity. In the Soviet collective, the Jews, as victims of atrocities of the war, were not safe because hatred was infectious. They needed to split from their real origins to avoid being intimidated and name-calling and physical and emotional abuse. When we kept our identity, we had a life of continuous guilt and degradation, created by the collective and the shameful stereotypes of our ethnicity. In the stereotype of the collective, Jews were greedy and cowardly and were always betraying the trust of the dominant ethnicity. In the Soviet collective, the biggest insult was to be called a Jew. When we stubbornly admitted it, it was comparable to an act of suicide. Hate found fertile ground, and in those circumstances, we were completely right when we did not disclose our ethnicity. It was not an act of cowardliness. It was common sense when we did not want to put the self in the position of a target. To avoid discrimination, some minority members changed their answers about being a minority. We falsified the 5th paragraph of our identification documents so that we were the members of the dominant ethnicity. The situation in the Soviet collective was not safe for us to disclose our original ethnicity. We are the new generation of survivors. The children of survivors were not immune to the horrors of hate. From birth, we knew what hate was about. Eventually, we were able to stop the splitting and move away from hate. Because of our struggles, the world does not live in complete darkness. We brought to the world the hope for the love. We were brave and we were not scared to unify with our painful past. In our families, the past was deeply hidden from others. The process of dealing with the past required from us a lot of strength. We restored the memories of the shocking experiences and relived the horror of the traumatic events. Until the right time came, we were scared. We continued to split from loved ones, from our own safety and human right. Our psyche was losing the ability to trust anyone because hate was everywhere. As a result of trauma, we lived in misery. Only some of us, the members of the new generation, and only after a special meeting with love, were we able to unify our psyches. Those lucky few were able to use their lives for love. When we were surrounded by love, we fly to the highest level of our aspirations. We show our creativity and desire to work, to build something, to acquire professional skills, and most important, to meet a partner in love. Leonya was a good worker and well liked by everyone. He spent all of his free time with Marinka, who helped him with his studies. After finishing high school, Marinka entered medical school, while Leonya attended evening classes at the technology university. But most important, Leonya and Marinka, who had known long ago that they could not live without each other, finally revealed the news to their parents. There were, of course, no objections. The birth of their first child brought happiness to all of them. The boy was named Stepan after his grandfather, Partisan Stepan Luchko. The baby belonged to the new generation of love. As a new seed, our new generation had one very special quality. We were not easily intimidated and scared. The hate did not have strength to get us. We were heroes and got into history as the brave generation. We were not afraid, leaving the life of comfort in the Soviet collective. Many left because their life was poisoned by the lies and intimidation of the hate. No reason was strong enough to make us want to stay. The new generation of the survivors were also immune to the fears of unknown, and our destiny is to be saved. Stepan Kliveruchko, the son of Leonia and Marinka and a member of the new generation, was fearless and was not afraid of reliving the horror of the past. We became the fighters against the hate and changed the collective society to make it more flexible. We made a lot of public protests and endured a lot of harassment. Eventually, we wanted to leave the collective, and we went away from the workers' paradise and built our own new reality. We were not afraid of jail or intimidation or persecution. We did not have fears and were called refusnik, who were refused the exit visa from the Soviet collective. We did not want to be stigmatized as second-class citizens and carry the guilt of offenses fabricated by monsters. Our psyche preferred unification to safety, and we felt safe because we were not afraid of torture. The Soviet collective ruled by fear, but was helpless against our fearlessness. Now we were equals, unified with our history and language, with our honor and dignity, which were looted by the Soviet collective. The war, which was the extreme hate, created the big split in our morals. During the war, there was always a split between the frontline heroism and criminality. After the unthinkable time when citizens were killed, tortured, raped, and robbed without any second thought and fear of justice, the morals in the collective were very low. The war split us from humanity, tenderness, consideration, care, and most important, love. We had to be very strong to resist the split. During the war, women became a leading power and sacrificed everything. They lived without intimacy because their only thoughts were about supporting the fighting men. After the war, many men were dead or placed into labor camps. The motherland was suffering from the losses. Everywhere was ruin and poverty because there was not a sufficient quantity of healthy men. The country did not have enough manpower to satisfy lonely women. The war ended, and after the atrocities and fears, we wanted to have fun. For a woman, the biggest dream was to have a husband with all of his extremities intact. Men were a big commodity. One surviving man may satisfy many women, but during the war he learned to live without a woman's love. In wartime, men lived in the company of other men. After the war, they often drank in the company of other men and told war stories. Many men released from military service did not work because they were always drunk. At nighttime, they did not do the much-needed man's work. When we were deprived from the most important necessities, such as sex, we get angry and violent. Our morals get weaker, and we became the carriers of hate. In the Soviet collective, a new crime was on the rise, the rape of men and women. The women hunger for sex, kept a man's penis tight by rope, and did not allow him to ejaculate. In this kind of raping, a man had the ability to please a group of women, but then needed hospitalization for internal damages to his penis. And after recovery, he may not be able to have children. In several cities, the women refused to work because there was not even one man in the area. The government placed military bases in some metropolises with only one goal: soldiers who could satisfy the working women. The women lured the soldiers into their houses with drinks and good food as payment for sex. A man could get lucky everywhere because he was a rare commodity. Lust replaced the love, and single mothers raised children without knowing the name of the father. The ruined collective after the war was a sexual paradise for a healthy man because there were many needed women. The country also was filled with the abandoned and crippled, the casualties of war, but no one needed them. The number of cripples increased because many youngsters lost their extremities when playing in former battlefields, stepping on hidden explosives. Many displaced and desperate cripples from occupied territories moved to low-populated islands because their cities and villages had been burned during the war. Professor Krivoruchko affirms that the members of the Workers' Paradise were completely insensitive to cripples because for a long time there was a shortage in all necessities and members were not generous enough to share anything with anyone. The misfortunate saw only struggles and misgivings. They were everywhere begging for small change, and they brought the heartlessness and injustice of a war to the cities that were miraculously spared from physical destruction. They brought misery and qualms and carried a split from the love of the survived land. They were just ordinary casualties of the patriotic war. Someone ordinary was called an anti-hero. After the war, the stereotype of the anti-hero was someone average, who did ordinary things and was unimpressive. The anti-hero would not say to everyone that he was the bravest and stormed enemy citadels. Every day he went to his ordinary and unattractive job which had no glory. Instead, the heroic characters were the too many drunk heroes reveling in their fabulous stories. They told so many extraordinary things that anything ordinary was just not popular. The anti-hero was a family man who did not want to fight for glory and who cherished the stability. In the Soviet collective, those feelings were shameful. The anti-hero was a carrier of reprehensible feelings only because he did not want to spread any lies. His aspiration was to raise his family in comfort and to be a good provider. The collective had a skeptical view on the desires of the family man and projected him in the media as unattractive because he did not make any sacrifices. It projected as shameful that a man only loved a woman and raised his children. In order to unify with the ordinary, family men needed to pay a heavy price by splitting from the attractive stereotype of the hero. Many members of the Soviet collective pretended to be heroes, and as a result, so many youngsters had a desire to be one. The stereotype of the hero was someone extraordinary who had enormous patriotic feelings and risked his life for the collective. The appearance as a hero was flamboyant and extravagant, and the most important quality for a hero was winning. The price did not matter. Definitely, he did not look ordinary. The members of the Soviet collective had to have a lot of guts to embrace the ordinary. Nevertheless, many ordinary people provided the groundwork for a country to move ahead. Professor Krivoruchko wanted to unify with the image of a family man, the same as his grandfather Alexander did. His desires came from the deepness of a big heart, and he was part of the universal love. He believed that find a soulmate was the most important task of his life. The Krivoruchko family was physically well and happy. They were glad to be alive and delighted in the fact that they'd found each other. They were very careful and did not criticize the government and avoided any repulsive feelings. They understood that they could appreciate soulmates only in love. They asserted the self be successful in love and knew that they could not recognize love in the abhorrence. They were grateful for someone special in their lives and did some groundwork to get in touch with the love in their hearts. With a solid identity, it is much easier for us to be in harmony with the self. We do not have any disturbing turbulence inside and feel good about our choices. When we are rigidly fragmented and split, love is a very challenging task. We can see somebody every day and do not know that this is our soulmate. To meet a soulmate is an arduous task. We see with our eyes, but we meet with our soul. The sad fact is that we can meet our soulmates when it is too late and they are not available, so we cannot express our love. For anti-heroes, the ordinary desire to find love became an extraordinary one. The achievement of manhood was to meet a match, to start a family, and establish the self as a family man. The cover-up of secrets. Our secrets and the efforts to cover them up create mistrust and suspicion, and our secrets are part of the splitting force. Maintaining secrets is a pure splitting because it creates inside our psyche a lot of fears, anger, and resentment. In order to keep a secret, we split from many of our fragments, and as a result, we reject a big part of ourselves. In many instances, the fragments from which we are splitting need our protection and help, but instead we dump them. We hide from our consciousness the part of ourselves that is the most vulnerable and fragile. As a result, we pretend and want to appear to the world like we are not who we are. The secret also splits us from others because the process of keeping a secret is very demanding. We need to protect our secrets, and because we are afraid to reveal them, we are not frank with others. The secret may be our own or a family secret. The family secret puts a lot of responsibility on all the family members. Because of secrets, the aged members get tired from the constant altercation and just want to enjoy steadiness and comfort. The secrets of the older generation are preserved by the youngsters and bring a lot of clouds over the supposedly bright childhood. Despite family secrets, the young Professor Krivoruchko had a good childhood because he was a child of love. As he grew older, he became a happy man who was proud of the self. His love force got stronger and brought him to the universal circle of love. He was an addition to the cosmic goodness. Unfortunately, he did have a big secret, and he needed to pretend. If at one point in his life he did not stop pretending, his psyche may not unify. He had a long way to establish his identity as a solid one. And one day he needed to open up about his family secret. This secret and need to cover damaged psyche and caused a big split, but he brought that to an end. Unlike the older generation, he wanted peace and stability. The new generation had distinctive ideas. The youngsters created very challenging goals and did not want any ghosts in their closet. The fight to achieve those goals required a lot of uncomfortable movements and changes to the existing structure of their psyche. The split between external and internal. The split between internal feelings and external appearances causes a life of misery. It is an old controversy between forms and essence, and it is about the split inside and the cover-up on the outside. We pretend to cover up our internal split, and our fragmented identity causes a lot of dissatisfaction and resentment. Our ethical fragments are united against the one that we consider weak, dishonest, and conforming. When our negative feelings are strong and we are dissatisfied, we are against the fragment which is conformist. We feel split in all of our diverse manners of expressionism. Our mind organizes the unique combinations of splitting sizes. When we feel content, we are against the rebel who is not happy. The split in our psyche may be against the rebel or conformist, and it provides us with diverse responses. When we display the presence of a split in visual form, we avoid eye contact, evade conversations, project uneasiness of being in public places, and feel a challenge in participating in activities. The splitting in oral and kinesthetic styles can be seen in the avoidance of conversations, uncommon pitches of voice, tightness, and general anxiety. In St. Petersburg, the young Stepan Krivoruchko was returning home on a warm spring day. His school uniform looked neat, and he was an excellent student and had many friends. He was involved in helping fellow students who were unable to keep up with their schoolwork, and he had confrontations with delinquents who were unwilling to wear appropriate attire to the school. Such students appeared at school wearing striped jackets, bell-bottom trousers, and platform shoes. Schoolwork was of no interest to them. Their main concern was the impression that they made on girls. Stepan also owned some fashionable items, and he bought his shoes at the government store, with platforms added by a private shoemaker. He had Italian shoes, but did not see a reason to show off at school. The girls in his class noticed him anyway. He did not have any difficulty in finding a girlfriend, but he felt that it was not time for that yet. Meanwhile, he spent his time fencing, a sport which he excelled in, and he could perhaps become a champion. Nevertheless, he was not a happy child. In his psyche, the split was on diverse modalities and was internal and external. On the outside, he was splitting from the rebellion fragment and conforming to his surroundings. On the inside, he was a rebel. His psyche needed pretending and sided with conformity because the unification with rebellion probably could put him in danger. In the meantime, the process of covering up the split drained a lot of his energy and could be the reason for his emotional turmoil. The one split in his psyche caused the other in his exterior to cover splitting from the rebellion fragments. He emerged as an ordinary individual who conformed to the norms of the surroundings. In his interior, the splitting between a conformist and a rebel produced feelings of misery and anger. On the eve of his 16th birthday, he was beset by anxiety. He was about to become the bearer of his own identification card, where he just needed to put his ethnicity. Any carelessly spoken word could upset him. He was especially miserable during the current affairs discussions at schools. Although he felt quite comfortable when the discussion centered on American imperialism, any mention of Israeli aggression and of Zionist racism made him shudder. His split was triggered by oral stimulations, which were the current affairs of discussions. The split had something to do with the belief in general position of the collective government, which for many years was anti-Zionist. In the eyes of the collective, the Zionist movement looked very unattractive. The condemnation of this movement by ordinary citizens was a sign of devotion to the collective. When as members of a Soviet collective we felt good about the Jewish state, but we also had feelings that we were betraying our beloved collective because we embraced a structure that was, in the opinion of the collective, ugly and inhuman. The official logic was intolerant about it. Collective did not allow us any deviation from a proved directive. If we loved something in that opinion of the state that was ugly, then the conclusion was that we were in danger of being perverts and possibly retarded. To conform with the official directive, we learned to restrict our appearances and covered our internal turmoil. We cannot get rid of the fragment in our psyche. It does not matter how hard we will try. We will not get rid of the rebellious fragments in our psyche. We are not able to run away from the self. If we do not have peace within, we might not find it on the outside. The split can catch us everywhere, even in dreamland. Our desire to run away from one of our fragments can possibly destroy our identity by creating disassociation and splits from other fragments. The fragment is ugly and makes us feel ashamed. Nevertheless, we put a lot of energy into the hope we are capable of getting rid of it. When we understand that it is impossible, we protect our secret about having a hidden fragment. We keep our secret from others, even at the expense of our happiness. When we do not have enough strength to do it anymore, then it is time to deal with the secret. Otherwise, we will be powerless from keeping it inside. Our identity has a hole, and in order to become solid, we need to patch it up. We do this by having a dialogue with the fragment that we are hiding. The world lives through big changes, but still, for every lowlife, the Jews were scapegoats. Instead of calling the Jews by dirty names, they called us Zionists. To be sure that no one would offend Jews in the Soviet collective, ideologists made up stories of Jewish cowardliness and equated Zionism to fascism. Many people did not feel safe admitting that they were Jewish. After the Holocaust, no one wanted to be a martyr. Some changed their ethnicity on identification documents. They also knew that in the Soviet collective, any discussion defending Jews in Israel would bring only trouble. If some snitch reported to administration that someone was defending the Jews, that person could lose his job or other privileges and would be questioned by the Department of Security. Cruel people would say, "If you love Jews so much, why do you stay in our land? Go to your Palestine, because otherwise we'll take a whip and we'll throw you out from the motherland." In the workers' paradise during Stepan's growing up, everyone had the power to slur Jews, put them down, and not be afraid of any consequences. The scams and drunks yelled insults on the streets, and when they were offended, they called the others a Jew. This appeared to be one of the biggest insults and caused fights. Definitely the person who was called a Jew was insulted. The police never stopped any mudslinging and verbal abuse related to Jews. In the Soviet collective, the ethnic hater was skillfully promoted. It was no secret that Jews in the collective felt as second-class citizens, and in the presence of the majority opinion, they often acted cowardly. It was very seldom that we would declare ourselves a Jew, and we avoided it, if at all possible. It was like confessing to being a thief. Many of us hid it as a deep secret. Professor Krivoruchko confirmed that the crucial point was to get in touch with his fragments, acquiring a unifying psyche, and feel good about the self. When he was young, he did not believe in the rumors and lies. He lived a double life and was not proud. On the surface, he was a very handsome, bright member of a youth political organization, but inside he was overwhelmed with doubts. Legally, in identification documents, he belonged to the dominant ethnicity, and so he did not go through many humiliations. He had a bright future in the collective, and if he would be able to forget about his roots, although if he did, he would be involved in the process of even a bigger splitting. He would have given up hope of having a solid identity. From any perspective, if he complied, he would always have a fragmented identity, because it was not possible to get rid of one of his fragments, which was also a very well-guarded secret. The fragments are hidden in a closet. Fragments which are kept in a corner of our minds strive to get out and create painful feelings in our psyche. Unification sometimes is just not possible, and when we resist it, we are just torturing the self. The fragment that is our deepest secret creates a big discomfort. Like a blister on our skin, it does not give us a chance to enjoy life. Perhaps the reason is that a time is coming when this fragment is supposed to come out from the closet. Similarly, the fragments of the victims of atrocities of the war were crying for action, because the fragments of their dead relatives pushed out from the closets, the thousands of refuseniks were obsessed with the goal of leaving the collective. In many instances, the push was beyond their conscious awareness. This situation is comparable with the turmoil that the childless woman has in her psyche when she gets to the limit of her childbearing time. At this particular time, the fragment of an unborn child becomes active and pushes the psyche for action. Some childless women want a child, and without one they would perhaps may not assert themselves as a whole individual with a solid identity. They will always suffer from a split from the fragment of motherhood. This fragment may perhaps be on an oral, visual, kinesthetic, or olfactory sensor. The pain of a split from motherhood and an unaccomplished life may be triggered by the look of someone else's child, the voice of a child, a hug from a child, or even the smell of a child. In the same way, the thousands of people that were on the streets when the Berlin Wall fell were pushed out by the liberated fragments. The fragments were the images of loved fragments that wanted free from the closet. There are moments that are very significant for the rest of our life. Stepan was in a critical moment of making an important decision. This time in his life was crucial because it set up a mission for a later time. He tolerantly waited for the right time, but otherwise his future was looking quite bright. He was very competitive and could expect prizes in fencing, but he was burdened at the same time by thoughts that robbed him of his peace of mind. Who was he? Why were his father and grandfather both Jews, registered in their passports as members of the dominant ethnicity? Why were his Jewish acquaintances in Paris when they were asked about their ethnicity? From where did all of these wartime stories about the cowardliness of Jews come? What was the origin of these anti-Jewish jokes that depicted Jews as greedy? Why was a monument mark not set in place where his grandmother Riva and Lizochka were murdered? Stepan's grandfather, who had Ukrainian ethnicity, had been honored with a monument as a hero partisan, and everyone respected his memory. The school where his grandfather had taught now bore his name, but the martyrs of Babi Yar remained unmentioned as if nothing had ever happened. His grandfather had been a partisan and died in military duty, but all of those massacred at Babi Yar were civilians. His grandfather had been a partisan and died in military duty, but all of those massacred at Babi Yar were civilians, and their only crime was that they were part of the Jewish race. The memory of the Holocaust victims seemed to be blotted out deliberately by all possible means. Stepan felt that the memory of the innocent who perished by the hands of monsters were as important as the memory of the heroes. The thought of this injustice and the ardent wish to rectify it led the young man to take the following step. He would let the monument to his natural grandmother Riva and his aunt Lizochka, who died as a baby, be erected through his decision to register as a Jew. Let the plant that was burned and stepped upon take new roots in his family. Stepan told his intentions to a pragmatic man. His grandfather, Alexander, was not at all enthusiastic. "What do you need it for, my grandchild? Think of your future. You won't be accepted into the university or be able to go abroad with your fencing team. And what if there is suddenly another pogrom epidemic?" I remember in 1953 in the Soviet Collective during the Jewish doctors' trials, were accused of poisoning patients. And mobs broke neighbors' windows. Who knows what might happen now and later? And what kind of a Jew are you if you have a Gentile mother? You don't know your language, history, or religion. I understand that many youngsters are facing such contradictions, but you technically are not a Jew. By education and upbringing, you are a bearer of the culture that belongs to the dominant ethnicity. You do not understand how lucky you are that you are not a Jew. Many Jewish youngsters are being held back because of their ethnic background. They're not permitted to be acquainted with their own culture. Many are ready to renounce their Jewish origin and disappear within the collective. I honestly believe that it is very difficult and unsafe to be a Jew. In the Soviet collective, never was there any basis for a spiritual and cultural revival of the Jews. But Stepan remained adamant in his decision. When he brought his application to the identification card office, the woman in charge gave him a surprised look. "You state under the heading of ethnicity that you are a Jew. You cannot register you as a Jew because according to your birth certificate, both of your parents are of dominant ethnicity. But the Constitution of the Soviet Collective gives every citizen the right to choose his ethnicity. I cannot help you. I have my orders. If one of your parents were Jewish, then by all means." Stepan's survivor skills were a hereditary quality. He did not survive the split and lived through the moment of unification with his inherited past. He had endured a lot of psychological pain until he let his secret out of the closet. The rules of survival change us. The rules of survival change us because when we are splitting, we are reaching a limit. We split from the traditional rule of survival, and when we are in danger, we run away by cutting the losses. Our psyche splits when we do not have an opportunity to follow a map genetically designed for us to reach a solid identity. In moments of menace, this map is scratched out. Our psyche is flexible, and under pressure we perhaps may abandon our identity, which is not needed for survival. In moments of danger, we can become something else. To survive, we change our psyche. We get diverse functions and make adjustments to an uncommon morality. When we need to survive, our universal translator stops the regular translation of the visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory stimulations to common logic. Because we are splitting from previous frames of reference to facilitate survival, our psyche allows us to split from the obvious and create new meanings. During survival, we are not concerned with losing our solid identity because our goal is to salvage whatever is possible. Many families survived the physical extermination and cared more about surviving than their solid identity. Survival for them was the most important goal, and to be a survivor became their identity. They were ready to trade off a lot of their beliefs just to survive. Professor Krivoruchko stated in The Collective, we, the new generation of the survivors, did not have a goal of physical survival because no one threatened us with physical extermination. But our identity, which was inherited from previous generations, was on the verge of dying. The systematic pressure on us from the collective to give up our birth identity created a lot of resistance. The collective was involved in the ideological assassination of our unique ethnical awakening. Our rules of survival did change when our splitting reached a dangerous level. The collective never accepted us as equals, and the workers' paradise always undermined our indisputable achievements. We were unable to learn our language, our history, and our heroes. To survive in the collective, we were forced to split from our identity and to become an ugly hybrid because culturally we had one face, but our IDs told us something else. Eventually, the continuous split in our psyche reached the limit of our tolerance, and we did not want to compromise the self anymore. The Muslim soldiers in the Red Army were forced to eat pork. The Army did not want to carry any burden of respecting special dietary needs. Some Muslim boys preferred to commit suicide than eat pork. The Jewish boys were supposed to be kosher, but after years of slaughter in the Holocaust, they would eat pork. Inside, we had a deep resentment of the Soviet Army's inconsideration. We probably did not say anything out loud against the draconian rules because we were registered as part of the dominant ethnicity. Our silence created a lot of attention inside. As victims of the splitting, we wanted to be invisible and were hiding in the closets. Meanwhile, the majority ethnicity was not able to understand that we may possibly have resentment and did not want the pork-based foods. They were overconfident and full of pride by believing that we loved their lard, which they proclaimed to be the best in the world. They were certain that we were looking for a chance to grab all of their grease. They were not concerned with the feelings of guilt, even after Muslim soldiers committed suicide. They honestly believed in one explanation. Why would a soldier kill himself for that? He was just a crazy person. Our need for unification was replaced by splitting to placate Big Brother. In the collective, the dialogue with minorities never started, and this was one of the reasons why we changed the rules of splitting. We did not want it anymore. The system finally fell apart, and the conflict became visible. We did not want to be the victims. We got out of the closet, and we made a lot of noise. The meeting happens when we are ready to recognize it. The meeting can only happen in due time when we are ready to recognize it. To look for a meeting, we need an aspiration to have it. If we do not want it and are not able to appreciate it, that means that we will miss it and will continue with the split. We possibly do not have any ability at the same time to have a dialogue. Splitting and unification are complementary and cannot possibly exist independently. It is like day and night, which are impossible to have together. In the daytime, we reach out to the world, but as night comes, we crawl back into our burrows. It is not forbidden to dream about the light during the night, but our dreams do not always come true. We possibly dream about dialogue, but we also understand that dialogue requires two sides. Otherwise, it is a monologue. Dialogue requires openness, understanding, and compassion. Unfortunately, our situation in a collective was not good, not only for a dialogue, but it was not appropriate even for negotiations. Our negotiations required the willingness of both sides to have an agreement. The light and dark perhaps were not agreed because they never met. The time of confrontation is when one side, by brutal force, gets rid of its opponents without any attempt to mediate. Manipulation, when others are playing with our mind, is threatening and cunning. We are not able to negotiate with the manipulators because they do not accept us as equal partners and would not respect any agreements. It would be foolish for us to start negotiations and open the self to destruction. To negotiate with the other side, first we need to have an atmosphere of negotiation. Before any negotiations, we meet our fragments. The best situation for a meeting is in an atmosphere of being strong and ready to face responsibility. When we meet with the self, we do not have any place to hide from our real self, and we cannot pretend that nothing happened. Stepan Krivoruchko knew how to control his emotions. He also understood that by showing his real feelings, he may probably jeopardize the well-being of his family. He wanted a dialogue, but at the same time, it was impossible to have a meeting and dialogue outside of the psyche. He would get an identification card that did not reveal his identity. Even though he felt like shouting at the ID clerk, "My father is a Jew," he remained quiet because he did not want to ruin his father's career as a decorated partisan heading a department in the arms plant. If it was discovered that his father had given false information and had hidden his real origins, there would not be an end to his troubles, and he would probably be fired. "Oh, I was only joking," Stepan said quietly. "Some sense of humor you have, my friend," the clerk replied. "You do not understand, young man, what a blessing it is to belong to the founding nation. I suppose many Jews would be happy to register as a dominant ethnicity, if only we would allow it." Stepan was not convinced of this declaration. "I shall be a Jew just the same," Stepan said to the self as he left the identification card office. "There will be a time and place when I will freely call myself a Jew, and no one will be offended. I will leave this country, and I will not do it because of money or commodities. I will look for a place where I feel safe and where I will not need to lie." In other words, Stepan promised the self to resist splitting and to look forward for unification. To unify his identity, he needed to meet some conditions. He also needed to find a safe place where he was able to be proud of his identity. He started looking for a safe place. When he found it, he needed to be sure that it was the right place for him, and then he had to overcome the obstacles on the way to reach this place. The laws of splitting and unification are universal. The laws of splitting and unification are universal, and they affect countries in the same way as they affect individuals. There are some organizations that are always in the direction of splitting, even when they are completely changing the way they operate. After the war, the Soviet collective steadily moved in the direction of splitting, and eventually this trend ended with a big crack. The collective missed plenty of the signs and ignored the need for internal dialogue. The workers' paradise was cautioned by many signs that the big crash was coming. The structure of the Soviet collective itself was involved in the splitting. The power structures manipulated the people, and without shame they took from us everything they could. Taking wealth from one of the segments of society and redistributing it to another is part of the collective mentality. During this reign, the collective government took from us our property, hopes and lives, our land and possessions. Throughout the period of industrialization, the collective arrested us and sent us to slave labor camps or the Gulag. The idea of taking from us and not giving back continued after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Grabbing wealth from the oligarch was on everyone's mind. The rich were stereotyped, and the concept of taking wealth from the rich and redistributing it to the poor was very appealing. Limiting human rights by taking away from the population the right to have possessions was very tempting for powerful leaders. To suppress the guilt of doing it, ideologists came up with a lot of moralistic excuses. Generally, the idea of giving something to others was not as attractive as an idea of receiving it. Philanthropy was not in favor. The reality was that one took something that in the first place did not belong to him, but somehow that person felt entitled to have it. The idea of receiving something without deserving it and without putting in an effort was the mentality of the dependent and antisocial, and lately the attitude spread throughout the main population. It became very popular all over the world, but was exceptionally widespread in the Soviet collective. The members of the collective were not motivated to produce because they were not used to having honest reimbursement for their efforts, and they did not want to take any risks. By working as entrepreneurs, they did not have any guarantee that they would ever enjoy the fruits of their labor. They did not take risks themselves, but they also had a strong resentment towards anyone who had the guts to risk. Normally, the ordinary person was motivated by an opportunity to get up in a new social, economical level. But in the collective, the richness was a shame. In the workers' paradise, our wealth was usually not attractive and was scary because in many minds it was associated with crime, blood, and treachery. Productivity was comprised by association with the forced labor. The healthy part of society may generate a lot of wealth, but the people did not want to be ostracized for being involved in the murky financial transactions and for being associated with exploitation. It was a dead cycle. Without entrepreneurs, the industry did not produce and did not increase the nation's growth. The population was not getting richer. It was the beginning of the end of the workers' paradise. The redistribution of wealth never worked because the poor did not become rich from grabbing handouts. In fact, it was quite the opposite. By keeping the oligarch respectable, the smart society showed to others the examples of success and the existing opportunities of becoming victorious. The goal of the powerful was to motivate members to increase efficiency and to broaden the wealth. Only when the time was right did the wise slow down to some audacious investor who had acquired too much clout, because it would disrupt the economic arrangements. Nowadays, the post-Soviet collective does not want to learn anything from experiences and continue to dream of the redistribution of wealth. They do not understand that the timing is wrong. The witch hunting on the oligarchs is suicidal because it slows down the economy. By taking wealth from others, no one becomes rich and no one wins. The previous lessons did not teach them anything. The post-Soviet collective is pushing business under its control. Regrettably, the powerful are not interested in learning good things from the American past or from the shocking stories of their own history. In America, the old oligarchs were not better than the ones in the post-Soviet collective, but in time, when the first thoughts were about the increase of the nation's growth, the American government widely decided not to go after them. They closed their eyes to some of the misdeeds of the oligarch. The government did not punish them for financial transactions because it was more important to create a new field of opportunities. The goal was not taking money from the rich, but quite the opposite, to create more oligarchs and to widen the middle class. Only swindlers were stopped. The prime directive was to revive the economy, and the government punished oligarchs mainly for violence and inappropriate behavior. The post-Soviet collective is afraid that money is corrupting. That is not right. Instead of manipulation, monetary transactions teach us the art of negotiation and respecting contract, which is the first step in stopping and splitting and opening a dialogue. When the economy gets stronger, a business using manipulation is somehow straightened up. The law of splitting and unification predicts the improvement in relations between diverse economic groups. Because of the universality of many issues, the mutual benefits of unification are obvious. The fragile structure of the psyche might be reinforced. The fragile structure of our psyche may be reconfigured by diverse interventions, which include the identification of our fragments and the awareness of our strengths and weaknesses. The reinforcement of our psyche's structure helps, but it is not a guarantee of our stability because our psyche is in a rearranging state. Our individual psyche displays sophisticated and atypical designs, is represented by the consistency in the organization of the psyche, and depends on distinctive expressive modalities and the fragment's flexibility. Our psyche is a complex construction and has diverse organizational levels and substructures. The structure is built upon genetic heredity, environmental conditions, opportunity for growth, flexibility, and sensitivity to changes. Some psyches fall apart faster than others when a few configurations do not produce the needed support. One of the factors that we suspect is triggering breakdowns is the unevenness of our psyche. The fixated fragments cause problems with the adaptations and restructuring. The instability of our psyche causes rigid structures, and we are not able to create a strong relational bond and prevents the crash of our system. The fixated release of brain chemicals is not regulated by any adjustments and exceptions, and they are the causes of chemical imbalance. The rigid fragments are represented by fixated combinations of the brain's chemicals which produce non-changeable reactions on dissimilar triggers. In other words, we constantly overreact and underreact to diverse stimuli. The psyche structures depend on the distinctive fragments in our psyche. Some fragments are tightly attached, but some of them are loosely connected. The brain's chemicals are always underneath our feelings, representing the diverse fragments. The fixated release of brain chemicals is opposite the brain's plasticity, when the chemicals have a fluid release and allow adjustment of the release according to the need. Even short interventions, which include the identification of the fragments, may stabilize the system. The process of identifying our fragments is present during times of negotiation. We are consciously aware of which of our characteristics may be an indication of our strength in negotiations, and we use them for that purpose. Plasticity is the most crucial characteristic of our psyche's organization. Without plasticity, our psyche is rigid and fixated, and our adaptability depends on plasticity, as well as the release of unique combinations and quantities of the brain's chemistry for different stimulations. Flexible fragments have fluid amounts of combinations and quantities of brain chemicals, which allows us to have adequate reactions to the trigger. The flexible fragments are very valuable and are the building blocks of a solid identity. The goal of restructuring is enrolling the fixated and flexible fragments in a genuine dialogue. By promoting genuine dialogue between fragments, we have the strength to reconstruct dysfunctional design, and we create an atmosphere of unification and build our solid identity.